Welcome back to Intro to Religion. In this part, we're going to look at the question of what is religion, or how to define religion. So we can begin by looking at the etymology, or the history of the word religion. The word religion comes from the Latin word religare, which means to bind back together. There are two different meanings that are suggested by this etymology. One is that religion binds people together. And a second is that religion binds people to God or to other sacred beings or realities. So one thing to keep in mind about etymologies is they tell you the origin of a word or its original meaning. They don't necessarily give you a guide to what it means now or what we ought to take its meaning to be. And they don't always serve as a complete definition of religion. So looking at the etymology is a good place to start. It does give us some meaning, some ideas about what religion is, but we should probe a little more deeply. If you think about it more carefully, you may discover that religion is actually difficult to define precisely and completely. Religion does not seem capable of being defined by a list of essential properties, as they're called. Essential properties are the group or set of properties that define what it is to be a kind of thing. That's why they are called essential, what it means to be a thing of a given kind, essence. So essential properties are actually two kinds of properties, necessary and sufficient. Necessary properties are shared by all members of the kind of things we're talking about. Sufficient properties are possessed by only members of the kind of things we're talking about. So let's give a concrete example. Suppose we want to talk about triangles. We want to try to define what it means to be a triangle, what the essence of a triangle is. Mathematical concepts like triangle or square or circle can all be defined precisely and completely using a list of essential properties. So the necessary properties of being a triangle are being three-sided and being a polygon. These are necessary for being a triangle. That means if you're a triangle, then you're three-sided, and then you're a polygon. Neither one of those is individually sufficient for being a triangle. So just because something is a polygon, that does not prove that it's a triangle. It could be a square or an octagon. Furthermore, just because something is three-sided does not mean it's a triangle, because the sides might be curves instead of straight lines or line segments. So we would say that being three-sided and being a polygon are each necessary properties for being a triangle. There's no single sufficient property for being a triangle because there's nothing unique to triangles. However, you would say that being three-sided and being a polygon are together or jointly a sufficient property for being a triangle. Because if you have both of those properties, then you're a triangle. So why are we going off on triangles when we're here to talk about religion? The point is that you're probably not going to find as convenient, precise, or complete a definition of religion as you will have of mathematical concepts or scientific concepts that can be defined with essential properties. An example of a scientific concept that can be defined in this way would be a hydrogen atom, which you can define in terms of its atomic number, 1. A hydrogen atom has exactly one proton in its nucleus. If an atom has more than one proton, then it's not hydrogen. And if it does have one proton, then it is hydrogen. So having one proton is both necessary and sufficient for something being a hydrogen atom. But religion is a bit more complicated and fuzzy than that. There seem to be examples of cultural movements and other cultural phenomena that partially overlap with religion but don't fit the concept entirely. So here are some examples: spiritualism and New Age. Spiritualism is a cultural movement that originated in the 19th century, and spiritualists tend to believe in ghosts or spirits that can be contacted through seances or through psychics or spirit mediums. The picture on the right is actually from a songbook that was published at the height of the spiritualist craze in the 1800s, showing a seance. And I guess the group of songs in the book were called spirit rappings. And spiritualism is still around today. There are still people influenced by the movement who perform seances or practice spirit mediumship influenced by this movement. So even though spiritualism has belief in spirits, which are supernatural beings, and that's also something that many religions have, spiritualism also has rituals where the spirits are contacted. However, unlike religions, spiritualism does not have a central tenet of a sacred being or a sacred reality that's worshipped or revered. In addition, there is no code of morality or sort of patterns of sacrificing, giving up certain things as a kind of spiritual or religious commitment. So it does seem to lack some of the important properties we associate with religions. New Age is another example. New Age is a cultural movement that started in the 1960s and 1970s in Western nations such as the United States. And it draws upon and mixes beliefs and practices from a variety of sources, including Asian religions like Hinduism and Buddhism, Western mysticism and magical traditions, Native American religions, astrology, belief in UFOs, and also it's been heavily influenced by the counterculture movement of the 1960s, which did a lot of things, but it included things like rejecting the traditional values of Western society in certain respects, like critiquing patriarchy, critiquing racism. Of course, those are not the only values of Western society, but they were trying to reform or revolutionize in some respect the norms, values, and behaviors of a lot of people in their culture. And that definitely influenced New Age as well. So New Age often does have a view of the sacred, unlike spiritualism, but it still lacks a kind of systematic moral code that's shared by most members of the movement, or a widespread practice of sacrificing or renouncing things. And those are a couple of the important properties you see again and again in a lot of religions. So it's probably best to regard religion as what's called in the philosophy of language a family resemblance concept. A family resemblance concept is one that's defined by a network of overlapping traits that are shared to a greater or lesser degree by things that fit the concept. So this is unlike concepts that can be defined with essential properties, what you might call discrete concepts. For those, it's a discrete line, whether you're in or outside of the concept, whether you fit the list of essential properties or not. There's no fuzziness, and it doesn't entirely make sense or always make sense to say that you can fit the list of essential properties as a matter of degree. You could say that you have some of those essential properties and not others, but the difference is there's still an explicit criterion with the essential concepts that allows you to either fit the concept or not. But family resemblance is not like that. There's always degrees of fit. So there's going to be a fuzzy boundary between religion and other areas of human belief and behavior. Now, the term family resemblance concept is metaphorical. It's named after human or other families of organisms. If you think about a family, and we can take for the moment families that are related to each other biologically through genetic inheritance, they're going to have some features in common, but not all. There are going to be certain features like green eyes or black hair or whatever that are common among members of a given family. But not all members of the family have to have those properties. And there can be people outside of the family that have those properties as well. So that's similar to a lot of concepts that humans use. In fact, If you think about it more deeply or systematically, you'll discover that the majority of human concepts may indeed be family resemblance concepts. Um, so we would use terms where it's a matter of degree whether they fit the things we're using them to describe, or we'll use concepts to classify things, and it's a matter of degree. You tend to see concepts that are more precise, those that can be defined by a list of essential properties. That's more common in mathematics, where all the concepts are like that, and in science, where many but not all of the concepts are like that. And this is just a kind of fact about the way the term religion is used in ordinary language and the way we think about the concept. It doesn't seem to be something we can define with absolute precision. So what should we do about this? Can we just give up on defining religion? That's one possible response to the idea that religion is a family resemblance concept. We just have nothing to say. A second possibility is we create what's called a technical definition, where you basically create a new definition that is precise, it is complete, it's a list of essential properties, and you just make a kind of mental note for yourself or your audience that, look, we're using the term religion in a very specific way in this context, let's say in comparative religion. That sort of thing is done in science, for example, when they have technical definitions of concepts like force that are used in much looser and broader ways in ordinary language. A third response, though, is to try to give a definition of the concept in terms of what you might call salient properties. Salient properties are characteristics that are common, noticeable, and important among the members of a kind of thing, but which don't count as essential properties. The basic idea is the more of the salient properties you have, the greater to which you fit the concept. So we're defining the concept as a matter of degrees of fit rather than absolute. So let's get to the salient properties of religion. I've identified 7 of them. There might be others. This is just a useful start to understand religion more deeply. We're going to go through each of these properties in more detail in the coming slides. But they are the sacred, the supernatural, ritual, sacrifice, morality, social, and mysticism. All of those 7 traits are very characteristic of religion. And the more of those properties a thing has, the more likely it is to be a religion, or you could say the greater degree to which it makes sense to call it a religion, or the greater degree to which it is a religion. So let's talk about the sacred. The sacred basically means something that has meaning or value beyond that of the ordinary world. So it can be contrasted with the profane. Profane means not sacred. It's of ordinary meaning or value. So an example can help illustrate the distinction. If you go to a Starbucks and order a cafe latte, let's say, suppose you really enjoy the cafe latte, and you may even get some enjoyment or meaning out of going to the Starbucks just to see people you're familiar with or whatever. Chances are, though, it's not a sacred experience, and the latte is not a sacred object for you, no matter how much you value it. So the sacred tends to have value that's categorically higher than that of the ordinary world. So an example of something of sacred value is the communion host in a traditional Catholic Mass, which you can see in the picture on the right. So the priest is holding up the wafer and the chalice with wine. Catholic Christians believe those to be the body of Christ, the body and blood of Christ, and so they're regarded as sacred objects. And the whole ritual and ceremony is a sacred ritual and a sacred experience. So religions generally focus on worshiping, venerating, revering, or honoring sacred beings, such as God, the gods, or spirits. That's one of the most important aspects of religion. Now, there are concepts of the sacred outside of religion too. So for example, someone might regard their country or their family as of sacred value to them. However, that type of value system wouldn't include most or all of the other salient properties of religion. So having a concept of the sacred or treating something as sacred is not a sufficient property for religion, but it's a highly salient property, especially when combined with the other ones on the list. Let's talk about some of the different types of sacred things. We already mentioned sacred beings like God, but the sacred can manifest in other ways as well. Sacred values are values that are categorically more important than ordinary or profane values, so they cannot be sacrificed or traded off for things of ordinary value. For example, if you're a Christian, you would regard Jesus as of sacred value. And if you're devout, you're not going to insult or reject or deny Jesus, even if someone offers you an amount of money for that, because those two values are not commensurable. You're not going to trade off the sacred value for the profane value. This is similar to non-religious phenomena, such as regarding your children as of sacred value to you, where you won't, hopefully, allow your children to be sold off or killed, no matter how much money or of some other value someone was willing to give you. There's no trade-off that's acceptable. A sacred time is a time of the day, month, or year that's associated with the sacred beings or realities that are worshipped by religions. So this can include holidays or festivals, for example. Sacred places are locations associated with sacred beings, such as their dwelling places or places where they perform miracles or other events associated with the sacred beings took place. An example of a sacred place is just a cathedral, church, or other place of worship, like the one shown in the picture on the right. Sacred experiences are encounters between people and sacred beings or realities. So this overlaps with the concept of mystical experience we'll talk about later. Mystical experiences involve an alteration of the sense of yourself, where you feel united with a sacred being or higher reality. Sacred experiences, though, can also just include witnessing a miracle or some other sacred event that doesn't necessarily involve a mystical experience per se. A second salient property of religion is the supernatural. So religions feature belief in beings or realities that have powers beyond that of the natural world. So the natural is actually difficult to define. It's used in many different senses, at least in English. However, for the purpose of defining supernatural, the most relevant definition of natural is something that falls under the system of causal laws that govern the physical world and that can be observed and measured through sense experience. So it's similar to the concept of scientific, but not identical, because there are aspects of the natural world that aren't necessarily known through science or a part of science. So a lot of your knowledge of the natural world, like your knowledge of the layout of your home, your knowledge of whether you're hungry or not, that's not scientific knowledge, and it's not necessarily a scientific fact or a part of scientific reality that you're hungry, let's say. So we don't want to just equate the natural with the scientific, but you could say the scientific is a theory of the natural. The natural is just all of the world or the universe that follows these patterns, these causal laws that we use to characterize and describe it. And the supernatural goes beyond that. It transcends the natural. There's at least two ways of being supernatural. One is to break or violate the laws of nature. So the main example of that is miracles. So for example, when Jesus walks on water, or when he resurrects Lazarus, brings him back from the dead, those violate the laws of nature as we understand them, so they count as supernatural events. And Jesus would have a supernatural power to perform those miracles and would thus be a supernatural being. Another way of being supernatural, though, is being outside of or prior to the natural world. And this could include a creator god or gods. So, for example, there are some people called deists who believe in God but don't believe in miracles. They believe that God creates the natural world and allows it to function in accordance with the laws that he set up to govern it. And he never breaks or violates those laws. So there are no miracles in the universe according to deists. However, they still believe in a supernatural being in some sense, insofar as God is outside of a system of natural law. And other examples of this could be creators like the Tao in Taoism from traditional Chinese religion, which is regarded as being the source of so-called nature or the universe and its patterns or rhythms, but not necessarily itself being subject to them. It's prior to them, it's bigger than them, it transcends them. The picture on the right shows Jacob wrestling with the angel based on the story in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Genesis specifically. And the angel is an example of a supernatural being, as is God himself. So religions also tend to have rituals. A ritual is a fixed sequence of behaviors that has a meaning or purpose. An example of a non-religious ritual is singing a national anthem. The purpose of the national anthem is to honor one's nation and to express one's commitment to it. And so that is similar to a religious ritual in that many religious rituals are intended to honor a sacred being or reality. So the religious ritual can be defined as a fixed sequence of behaviors that has a sacred meaning or purpose and is directed to, or at least invokes, calls by name, a sacred being. An example of a religious ritual is the sacrament of Holy Communion, in which a Christian consumes bread and wine that either are believed to be the body and blood of God or to symbolize and commemorate God or Jesus or his sacrifice. So let's talk about some of the main types of rituals. There are daily rituals that are performed every day at a certain time or a certain point. An example is Salat in Islam, which is daily prayer that must be performed 5 times a day. Another type of ritual is a festival. Now, festivals can also be thought of as groups or sets of rituals. They may involve more than one, and they also can just involve customs that are defined a bit more loosely than a specific sequence of behaviors, which is how we tend to define rituals. But festivals are performed at a certain time of the year. Sometimes a certain time of year that's staggered between years, but more common they're annual. An example of a festival is Christmas from Christianity, which celebrates the birth of Jesus. A life cycle ritual is one performed at certain important events in someone's life, such as their birth, a ceremony where they're named, a coming of age ritual, a marriage ritual, or performed at their death. So an example is the sacrament of holy matrimony in Christianity. And then there's what I call as-needed rituals. These can be performed whenever the occasion warrants, whenever the need arises. So an example from Roman Catholic Christianity is the sacrament of confession, which a Catholic Christian can do to confess their sins to a priest and be absolved if they perform penance. A fourth salient property of religions is sacrifice. And this is one of the properties that distinguishes religion from other spiritual movements or spiritual cultural phenomena like New Age and spiritualism. Now, there can be elements of sacrifice in other spiritual movements too, but they tend to be a bit more salient, focal, or central in religion. So sacrifice involves giving up something of value as a sign of commitment to a person, cause, principle, or group. There are at least 3 main types of sacrifices in religion. First is a ritual sacrifice. This is where you offer something valuable in a ritual directed to a sacred or supernatural being, often for the purpose of getting something valuable in return from that being. So this can be seen in the picture on the right, which depicts, it's a modern interpretation of a burnt offering ritual that would be performed at the first temple in Jerusalem in ancient times. That was the temple built by King Solomon. And in the burnt offering, there'd be an animal sacrificed, and it was basically burned and given to God. And this is common to many religions. You'll notice in the definition of ritual sacrifice, it mentions both sacred and supernatural beings. It's worth pausing briefly to clarify the difference. So the sacred being is usually supernatural, but the sacred being is regarded as worthy of worship. The supernatural being may or may not be regarded as truly sacred and worthy of worship. So pretty much all religions have a view of the sacred, but they also often have supernatural beings that are not sacred. So an example of that from Christianity is demons that are supernatural but not sacred. So another type of religious sacrifice is renunciation. This is giving up valuable things such as wealth, food, sex, the ability to talk or speak at will, physical comforts, or even your autonomy or freedom of choice for the sake of a religious goal. So you can see people do this in religion, such as the Lenten season in Christianity, in Catholic, Orthodox, and some forms of Protestant Christianity. There's a Lenten season where people renounce eating meat or certain other types of things as a sign of their commitment to their religion. And then a third type of religious sacrifice is commitment to moral rules or legal codes that are a part of the religion. And so pretty much all religions have certain actions that they prohibit and that you basically agree to give up, renounce your right to perform the actions when you join the religion or as a sign of your commitment to the religion. So another type of sacrifice is asceticism. This is basically just a more intensive form of religious renunciation. So asceticism is a way of life where you practice renunciation for the sake of things like spiritual purification, salvation, enlightenment, or some other spiritual goal. Some examples of ascetics are Christian monks. You can see one in the picture on the right, a Christian monk who lives in the Egyptian desert, a Hindu shramana or renunciate, and a Buddhist bhikkhu or monk. So basically there are two main types of ascetics, hermits and monks or monastics. Hermits practice eremiticism, which is practicing asceticism alone as an individual hermit and not living with a community. Monastics practice asceticism with a like-minded community of monks or nuns. And in addition to full-time ascetics, like monks, asceticism can be practiced for a period of time. For example, like the Lenten season in Christianity, if you're performing a Lenten fast, avoiding meat, for example, you could say that's a type of asceticism, albeit restricted to a specific period. And there's also traditions in some religions of taking a vow of asceticism that only lasts for a certain period of time. A fifth salient property of religion is morality. So morality can be defined as views or beliefs about the good, virtue, and the right. So ethics, or the theory of morality, which is a part of philosophy, makes distinctions between these three terms, the good, virtue, and the right. They each have a specific meaning. Good is what is of moral value. So you can think of it as the goal of moral action, what you're trying to produce or bring about in the world, either for yourself or for others. Virtue is a morally good state of character. So it refers to a property, a character trait of persons, humans and other persons, if there are any, like spirits or maybe some animals. So a virtuous person might be one who's just, who's generous, or who has some other good, stable trait of character. Honest, for example, you can rely upon them to tell the truth, and so on. And then the right refers to actions, particular actions or things like policies or laws that are worthy of choice for moral reasons, perhaps because they bring about good consequences, or perhaps because the nature of the action is morally choice-worthy for its own sake. It's intrinsically right, you might say. So religious morality consists of moral beliefs that are generally regarded as justified because of the wish or command of a sacred being, such as God, or perhaps some prophet or enlightened person. Some examples of religious morality are the Ten Commandments that you see in Judaism and Christianity. the 5 pillars of Islam, and the teachings of the Dharma Shastras, or duty collections from Hinduism. A sixth salient property of religion is the fact that it's highly social. So there's many different meanings of the word social. It's almost as ambiguous as natural, but it can be defined for our purposes as forming beliefs and performing behaviors in groups of people. So here are some examples of the social aspects of religion. Religious beliefs and practices tend to be learned from communities or societies. They're not just decided on by the individual. It's totally possible for an individual to have their own spiritual beliefs and practices, but religions tend to be characterized more by a kind of social conformity, at least to a degree. Another social aspect of religions is that many of the rituals are performed by groups of people, where people will harmonize their behaviors and words and act together. You can see this in the picture on the right, where there's a bunch of Catholic Christians praying in church. Another social aspect of religion is publicly verifiable sacrifices. So these are giving things up for the religion or the religious community or for the sacred beings that you worship in a way that can be verified by others. So this can be a way of signaling your commitment to the religion. One example of a public sacrifice is tithing, a custom practiced by some Christians and others where you give up 10% of your income to the church or religion. And another example of the social aspect of religion is just public affirmation and social enforcement of religious morality. So kind of checking up on other members of the community and either commenting to them or to others, or maybe even denouncing them if they're violating the rules of the community. So this is a social enforcement of the religious morality. A seventh salient characteristic of religion is mysticism. So mysticism can be defined as the deliberate cultivation of mystical experience through mystical practices. But what is the mystical experience? It's an experience of self-transcendence in which an individual goes beyond their usual or ordinary sense of self, and in which you may experience union with a sacred or supernatural being or reality. So what does this mean? It's difficult to define, although many people have had experiences of this sort. Basically, a mystical experience can be defined in contrast with ordinary waking consciousness, which is your ordinary experience of a self and the world. You experience yourself as being present, as being located in the world, spatially and temporally, but as distinct from the world and distinct from other objects of your awareness. This sense of a self as a separate entity or phenomenon tends to be reduced in mystical experience, and you get a sense of union or communion with some sort of other reality, often interpreted as a sacred or supernatural being or reality. So it's the change in the sense of self, and it's the experience of self-transcendence, which is highly characteristic of mystical experiences. And then mystical practices are just techniques for bringing about these experiences. There are many different kinds. Some examples are repetitive chanting of prayers or mantras, contemplative or wordless prayer, which is a part of the tradition of many forms of Christianity, meditation, which is practiced in many South and East Asian religions, such as Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism. Other ways of inducing mystical experiences include ingesting psychedelic substances, such as ayahuasca, which transform the usual sense of self and perception of reality. And then there are other things that can work as well, such as rhythmic dancing. You can see this in some West African religions, for example. The picture on the right is a sculpture depicting Saint Teresa and an experience she had in which she felt that she was penetrated by the being of God. And it's symbolized here, this is based on her own description, of an angel carrying an arrow that's about to be pierced through her body. So she felt very much infused with the spirit of or the presence of God. And that's highly suggestive of a mystical experience. So in addition to defining religion in general, which we've done by going through 7 of its salient properties, it's helpful to distinguish religions from sects. We can define sect as a smaller subdivision of a religion that has its own distinctive doctrines and practices. Now, most religions have multiple sects, so they've perhaps started as a unified phenomenon, but there were different sub-branches or sects of the religion that distinguish themselves by having different beliefs or practices. They still count as members of the same religion because they would have some core beliefs or practices in common, but they would differ as to others. So let's look at some examples. Jehovah's Witnesses, who you can see some Jehovah's Witness missionaries in the picture on the right, are an example of a Christian sect. So like Christians in general, Jehovah's Witnesses believe that Jesus is the Messiah and Savior. However, they don't regard him as a person of the Trinity, as being literally God. They reject the doctrine of the Trinity, which they believe is not founded on the Bible, but rather on later traditions. An example of a Muslim sect is Shia, which is actually just an Arabic word that means sect. Shia Islam, unlike Sunni Islam, believes that only family members or descendants of the Prophet Muhammad should be the leaders of the Muslim community. So that's a different belief they have from Sunni Muslims. As well, they have different practices. One example of this is it's more common in Shia Islam than in Sunni Islam to use icons or images of religious teachers, such as the early descendants and followers of Muhammad. Virashaiva is a sect of Hinduism that's actually quite distinctive. Some even argue it perhaps doesn't fall under the religion of Hinduism. Virashaiva is monotheistic. They only worship the god Shiva. And Shiva is a Hindu god whom most Hindus believe in and worship. However, the idea that you should only worship Shiva and that there are no other real gods, that's different from basically all other Hindus. And then an example of a sect of Buddhism is Rinzai Zen, which is a Japanese Buddhist sect. So it's a type of Zen, which is itself a sect of Buddhism focusing on meditation. Rinzai Zen, in addition to focusing on meditation practices, puts a lot of emphasis on what are called koan, paradoxical sayings, where if you reflect on them, you're supposed to get a deeper insight into enlightenment. So one example of a Zen koan is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? There's not supposed to be a rational answer to this. It's just supposed to help loosen your mind from its usual or habitual prejudices that keep you trapped and unenlightened. So basically all the religions we're going to study, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and so on, do have multiple sects. And finally, let's talk about the word cult and how it relates to religion and sect. The thing to keep in mind is that the word cult has 2 completely distinct meanings. The first meaning of cult, which is used both by scholars of religion and by members of religions themselves, is not negative in any way. It does not have a negative connotation. The second meaning of the word cult does have a negative connotation. The first meaning is that of an organized pattern of worshiping or honoring a sacred being or reality. So some examples from Christianity are the cult of Mary and the cult of saints. You can see these in Catholic, Orthodox, and Anglican Christianity. In Christianity, they only worship one God. However, there's also some customs surrounding venerating or honoring other beings regarded as sacred because of their proximity to God or being blessed by God. And these can include the Virgin Mary, the saints of the church, and angels and archangels as well. And other examples of using the term cult in this sense could be referring to the cult of Zeus, for example, the ancient Greek king of the gods. Especially in polytheistic religions, where there's multiple gods worshipped, there can be different practices associated with worshiping each god. So you might distinguish between the cult of Zeus and the cult of Apollo, the god of the sun, for example. The thing to keep in mind is this use of the word cult is not negative at all. And you could say that all religions, or almost all, are cults or have a cult in this sense, because they all involve worshiping or honoring a sacred being or reality. The second sense of the word cult is negative. It refers to a sect or religion that's characterized by an attempt to manipulate, exploit, or abuse its members. So let's look at a couple of examples of that. One is Jim Jones's People's Temple, which in the 1970s, Jim Jones was able to move a lot of his followers to a remote part of the north coast of South America. And once he had them isolated, he was able to convince many of them and manipulate many of them into committing suicide by drinking poison Kool-Aid. Another example is the Om Shinrikyo sect of Japan, which in 1995, its leader convinced many of his followers to perpetrate a terrorist gas attack in the Tokyo subway system using sarin gas, and that led to the death of many people. So this shows you that there can be religions and sects that have this manipulative, exploitative, and abusive quality. Now, some religions are accused of being cults, but it can be more controversial whether or not they fit this negative second sense of the word cult. It's also possible for religions to fit this second definition of cult as a matter of degree. There can be religions that exemplify more cult-like behavior than others, and this is often a way of referring to patterns of abuse or exploitation by the leaders of the cult on the followers or members. So that summarizes the main characteristics of religion and how they differ and relate to sects and cults. We'll see you in the next video.